wherever you're joining us from. My name is Adam Cheatham, and this is the Confluential Live. I'm the CEO of the Confluential, and we're here to talk about enterprise IT communications today. Um, Today it's just me. I know that you're used to seeing Kyler, and well, I'd rather see her as well. I hope to do my best to help you guys out with some important content here throughout the morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you join us from. A quick couple of things about us. So, the Confluential is an organization that specializes in helping our clients align business and the IT more effectively. So what we're looking to talk about today is what some of that looks like. We see a lot of different challenges where organizations come together and you have things that are being said like the business is not able to define the requirements. They are unable to provide IT with clean, clear expectations, or IT just moves too slow. They're just a bureaucratic mechanism for telling us no. Those are all types of things that are indicative of a different type of problem, right? Usually, we like to assume that the business and IT want to get along together, right? People want to do a good job for one another, and we want to be able to help each other out and being supportive of the overall organization, but that doesn't always come together the way that we thought we might expect it to. So, today we'll talk a little bit about overall what that looks like and how that comes together in reality. So, at the first we'll start a little bit more opening and context to the conversation. We'll talk a little bit about red flags, what types of challenges we see. So when we start to talk about where did the biggest disconnect between IT and the business exist today, we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. We'll talk about root causes. What's the actual problem, right? It's really easy to start thinking about things as well. IT just tells us no, so we'll build our own shadow IT department, or that guy in IT just tells us no, so we need to find a way of getting rid of him, or working around him, or going and asking somebody else. We see all of these types of challenges on the whole that create issues where the business and the IT are not aligned in expectations. Project management and governance is always a key to this type of conversation, but we'll talk about that from a perspective of project management isn't about creating structure that allows us to shut down ideas. It's facilitating the relationship between IT and the business. We've got to be able to do that effectively and be able to facilitate actual outcomes, and be able to meet the goals of the business with service delivery. After that, we'll talk about the maturity curve, and what it looks like when the business and IT mature together. What it looks like when the business matures a bit faster than IT, and what happens when IT matures a bit faster than the business. The key to maturity on the whole is really about um, just where you are, right? Just because you're not on level 5 maturity doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. A lot of organizations aren't that level, and that's okay. The challenge is more having equal footing, where the maturity of the business and the maturity of IT are in a similar space, and the relationship is functioning. You can have a low maturity organization that accomplishes quite a lot, but you could also have a high maturity organization that still has problems. So, talk a little bit about those types of challenges on the way, and then we'll at the end we'll kind of give an idea of what it looks like. If you want to think about what does it look like in my organization, what does my organization look like? Where do we sit on this from a kind of a self-assessment perspective, and give you some ideas of what it is we are able to help our clients with. So that's where we're at today. A couple of quick questions in the chat here. First and foremost, as we get into things, feel free to participate in this conversation. This isn't meant to be anything of a I just talk at you. If you have questions or comments and things that you see, feel free to drop them in the chat. And if you want to test out that function, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. We get lots of folks from all around the world, and we like to be able to accommodate folks from all around the world, because these are topics that the culture of the organization doesn't really change the dynamic that is IT and the business need to function together. Because when we ask questions like, is IT a support function or a strategic partner? The answer is yes, right? And a lot of it, which way you lean into one or the other, may depend on your product line. But at the end of the day, it is a support function and it is a strategic partner, because in this day and age, technology is required to be able to facilitate a business. And that way, the relationship between your IT department and the business becomes a key component of how it is these types of things function. So, as we jump in, thanks again for joining us today, and we'll start thinking about the overall conversation. So, um, where does this conversation start, right? And at the end of the day, it's a leadership challenge. Where you have this conversation, and leadership doesn't necessarily mean executives, right? There are leaderships at multiple levels of the organization, and IT leaders and business leaders need to be able to understand each other well enough to be able to understand the technology that's available and communicate the business value that is required, right? I have seen lots of business stakeholders misinterpret the availability of technology. There's a maturity curve in that as well, where the business says, this is what technology should be able to do, and this is how I want that to happen. And the reality is simply not that happens that way. AI and ERP are great examples where there's always and it's always fun to watch these types of things develop, where you have an understanding of what can be possible, right? And your mind starts to grow on, wow, ERP can do that for me, or wow, AI can do that for me. And you have this growing list of things that this software, this technology can do for you. And as that list of things that technology can do grows, you have this expanding mindset of all of these things that can happen. But at some point, your brain starts to find all of the things that it can't do as well, right? So we start to expand into this bubble that AI or ERP or fill in the blank technology can fill, and then you start to find the confines of it, right? What can't this technology do? And when you start to find that space, that's really where on the business side, reality starts to set in, and the business is able to serve more of an effective partnership to IT. On the flip side, IT needs to be able to understand the technology and the business well enough to apply it, right? If as we're talking about leadership challenges, when the business says this and IT says I can do that, or IT says I can't, if IT overestimates the technical capacity of the technology or their teams, we have a problem in expectations. If IT underestimates this, the business says, well, I'll just go do it myself. If you can't figure it out, you're supposed to be my technical expert, and you can't figure it out, I'll go figure it out on my own. So, really, where we think about this is how we align technology value with business outcomes, and how that translates into alignment. A lot of this is focused on trust and soft skills between managing that relationship between IT and the business, because at the end of the day, delivery of technology is not the same as delivery of value. You can deliver a lot of sophisticated technology and have it be nothing but a money pit. And part of the challenge with that is because IT speaks in systems, architecture, integrations, those types of things. And the business thinks in things like outcomes, execution of value, operations, risk, growth, right? These can happen together, but if they don't happen together, that's when the communication gap starts to grow. So, what we want to be able to do is have strong technology that supports people in a well aligned fashion. And so we end up with challenges like leaders unintentionally creating silos in departments and those types of things, that generally tends to be created from a mindset that is locked in on just this piece. And we don't want to think about just that piece. We want to think about the whole picture, because your business is not just one small piece or just a bunch of independent pieces. At the Confluential, we talk about confluences, and where work streams come together is where value starts to congregate. Those value areas are really where those silos are broken down, and where it is people start to work together, processes start to work together. And so facilitating that through technology is a piece of the challenge. And this isn't easy, guys. I mean, this is something that um, people work entire careers to figure out. Fortune 500 companies have problems with this. We have multi-billion-dollar clients that can't figure this out. And it's not because they're not smart or because they don't want to, it's because there's more to it than that. And being able to see it from the outside looking in a lot of times creates a scenario where we're able to say, this is where the challenge is coming up, and this is how we fix it. So you start to. I like this question from Avery. How can IT distinguish between a bad idea that should be shut down and an immature idea that needs better facilitation? In that the this is really indicative of why this communication gap matters, right? There are bad ideas. Like it's people say there's no such thing as a stupid question. There's no such thing as a bad idea. There are stupid questions and there are bad ideas, right? That doesn't mean that we should overreact and not have ideas or not ask questions for fear of them being stupid. I ask stupid questions all the time. Sometimes I find that what I thought was a stupid question actually leads to some of the more meaningful discoveries. So there, there are areas where we should dig into this so that we can start to identify the communication gap, because this question right here really gets at that heart of why that gap matters. Because when we have an issue in communication where we have misalignment on goals, we have uh, areas where IT doesn't understand the business, or the business doesn't understand how IT can help, we have this problem of, is this a bad idea or is it just poorly facilitated? And what actually ends up happening is teams blame each other, right? The business has an idea. And what ends up in this scenario, IT says, well, that's a stupid idea. That's not possible. You can't do that way. And the business says, are you for real? I'll go find somebody else to do it for me if you're gonna refuse to do that because you're not capable, right? And then on the flip side, sometimes the business does have a bad idea and they go and do something stupid because they didn't trust IT to be a partner for them, right? So teams start to blame each other and point the finger on, that's just because you're not capable, or no, that's because you just don't understand. Those types of things lead to shadow IT, and they more importantly lead to shadow IT that doesn't do anything useful. This really is founded on priorities that are unclear. Trust starts to significantly erode in this scenario. And when we start having these types of problems in communication, we start to end up with lots of other problems that become symptoms that are hard to identify what the root cause is, which is poor communication. Decisions slow down, priorities become unclear. We get projects that are quote unquote delivered, but nobody uses them, right? The IT spent all of this time working on this, and the business isn't even using it. And now IT says, "Well, why am I even doing any of this work to begin with?" And business says, "Why am I not getting any value from all of the things?" So the business goes and does their thing, and IT shuts down and says, "I'm just not going to do those things because the last time you asked me for it, I delivered what you said you wanted, and now you don't use it, and now I'm in trouble because that cost me money." And people are pointing that. So this problem becomes cyclical, as you can kind of see it happen. But we end up with wasting our investments in time and energy and money in a lot of cases. We have low adoption, we have projects delays, we have shadow IT, and everybody's frustrated. At the end of the day, what ends up happening is we start focusing more on whether or not a project gets quote unquote done, and thinking less about the value it actually creates. That's really part of where this communication gap and the relationship structure between IT and the business really matters. And you'll hear us talk about that, and I like conversation as it pertains to confluences again, in that there are a lot of different confluences between IT and the business. And there are a lot of different ways of structuring that. You have business units that use specific software package, and so you can structure IT to be aligned towards, this is a customer service tool, so this team is going to be more cleanly partnered with the customer service department. Or you can say, I have multiple teams that use this one tool, so I'm going to have one IT department that specializes in that tool. None of that really is particularly different from an outcomes perspective if you get the actual relationship building right. As we go on, we'll talk a little bit about what this looks like, how we identify some of these things from a perspective of red flags. So when we start to answer questions like, what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned working between technical teams and business stakeholders? One of those biggest lessons is that the red flags are a little more nuanced than they sound like they are. And you start to think about what sounds like the problem is actually a symptom of something different. So, a lot of the different types of issues between relationships between IT and the business start to indicate a bigger problem in communication and function, that collaborative function, those confluences between the two. When you hear things like, we need better reporting, IT needs to move faster, the system is broken, areas where everybody leaves the same meeting in agreement, but we find out later that we all had totally different expectations. Um, these are all symptoms of a bigger problem. So when we ask that question, what are the biggest lessons learned? These all sound like we need better reporting, or IT needs to move faster. So IT starts focusing on improving our reporting capability and increasing velocity. What ends up happening? Our unclear requirements and our misalignment, our vague requests from the business, our shadow IT department over here that's running anyway in the business, all continue to contribute to the problem. IT delivers faster, they output more projects, and the business continues to say, that's not anything like what I asked for. Because our problem isn't velocity. Our problem isn't our quality of reporting per se. Our problem is that the business and IT don't understand each other. And we're having issues with late involvement, escalations when somebody just gets frustrated and upset and says, I'm just going to call somebody's boss. I'm going to call my boss, and my boss is going to call that person's boss. And they're going to ask, why isn't this person getting this done? Or why hasn't this person communicated these things clearly? And now we have executives involved and what's really a bad communication structure. And now our executives can't communicate effectively together. All of these things start to create things like bottlenecks in a cyclical blame game, right? We have the business comes late to the table with new requirements. Whose fault is that, right? That's a red flag that indicates something different. Now, I just had a conversation with a client yesterday. I was talking to CIO about this, on how we solve this problem. Their issue is that they have late requirements come in all the time. But the problem isn't that the requirements are changing, which is what their sense was. It's that we didn't identify those teams that needed to be involved early enough. So now we have users in this system who actually need something to be a specific way, who we haven't been talking to. It's 3, 4 months into the project, and now they say, actually, that's not how we need that. I need something different. And then IT says, well, these are new requirements, or the business is changing its requirements. And that's actually true on the surface, but what the real problem is that we didn't involve the right people to begin with. We could have talked to the integration teams that needed to be involved in that conversation that weren't. We could have talked to the business stakeholders who should have been involved in that conversation and weren't. There are a whole slew of things that we could have done to identify the right requirements earlier in the process. So the problem isn't that requirements are changing, it's that they didn't exist to begin with. To a certain extent, we got to remember in this that requirements are a list of functional needs, and as we do this, we will always have a certain degree of unknown unknowns. We can't always know all of the requirements. We can't always document all of the user stories and acceptance criteria, but 9 times out of 10, that's a bad excuse. Saying we just can't know everything is a terrible excuse for we didn't do our job up front and planning properly. I would put 10 people in a room who have the same requirements problem, and I would guarantee that only one, maybe, was actually because they were appropriately identifying everything and new requirements were truly showing up. Those requirements have always been there. We just didn't find them when we should have. So that's a challenge where those late dependencies start to create issues, and we start having the business see IT as a blocker, right? The result of this is IT says, well, then I got more work to do. And the business says, well, you said you were going to deliver this next week. And IT says, well, that's not going to work because I got a month's worth of dev to do now that we have your new requirements. And again, we have the blame game, right? Business says IT's not delivering on time. IT says the business that's because the business, it's not my fault. The business is changing their requirements. They didn't tell us all of these things. And the real answer isn't that the business didn't tell them all of these things or that IT is delivering at the wrong pace. It's that somebody messed up and actually did documenting these things in the first place. They didn't change. We just didn't document them. And that's a key part of the conversation. So as we start thinking about things like frameworks that help translate vague business outcomes into actionable technical requirements without losing that intent, this is where that relationship becomes so important. If I know what people are asking for, I have a working relationship with my business, between my business and IT counterparts, and they speak each other's language at least well enough to understand what they're saying. This is where that comes in and creates a whole scenario where things are far more effective and things move on along together. What we end up with is, instead of an ever-changing scope and a milestone for completion that we never reach, what we end up with is we start to think about the relationship between IT and the business and improving that and focusing on that relationship, not these problems again, like those areas where our reporting is bad, IT is slow, the system is broken, the business is changing their requirements, and blah 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 blah. All of those are fixable problems because the problem isn't those individual things, it's a more holistic level of what is this. IT is not a blocker that's just saying no without explaining the trade-offs, and business isn't inconsistent in what they're actually asking for. We're just not communicating well enough in our relationship management to function as a group. So, um, what we want to start dealing with here is getting our roadmaps together in a way where we understand how they sync. We start to think about our priorities at the business and the IT level, right? IT is important in this too. We can't just say, well, the business gets what it wants and IT just has to suck it up. That's not right. But we want to make sure that we are creating a scenario where teams like our architecture department understand what tools are out there and which of our tools do what, so that we're not just buying a bunch of tools to solve individual problems. We're looking at our holistic architecture and our ecosystem to create value on the whole. At the end of the day, most of these types of business issues aren't as sudden as these red flags convey that they are. There are signals that come first. There are indicators that we can track, and we can work on those as we go, because the root causes really are spread across a number of different areas. Yeah, maybe the business should start asking IT why they're saying no, right? But at the same time, maybe IT needs to stop saying no. Like, I don't like it when like I play with words, and because words are important, and we're building an IT delivery function right now for a client where we've gone back and forth on the intake process, right? And maybe I'm overemphasizing the thought process here, but I don't like, from an IT intake perspective, I don't like the word approval. Like the results of of IT approving a project. The project is already approved when it gets to IT. So the business is approved the project. IT doesn't we don't want IT to say no, because that conveys a sense of the relationship that is less collaborative. What we want to have is a scenario where that IT intake process facilitates a broader understanding so that it can then be accepted, right? That's different than approved. IT is not rejecting projects. It is simply gaining enough information so that it can pass that acceptance threshold, so that we now know enough on how to build it. So when we start thinking about our approach to understanding communication breakdowns across teams, my approach to this question is really the thought process of tying together where our root causes are, and how it is we address them. And to answer this question of what's your approach to understanding communication breakdowns across teams, I break it into four different work streams. I like thinking about strategy, people, process, and technology. And at the Confluential, we focus on those work streams, and we focus on the confluences between them. So when we start to think about this, we'll start with strategy first, right? What are our root causes in this, and how do we understand them? How is the business communicating its expected outcomes and its priorities? How is the business communicating its overall 5-year roadmap and how we view the enterprise on the whole, right? If we're not communicating that well, how can we possibly focus on that technology confluence assisting in that strategy function, right? Business strategy and technology need to be clearly connected. If we just say we're going to double in 5 years, IT go help, that's not useful. If we start to say we're going to double in 5 years by purchasing other organizations and we're going to maximize our profit margins by taking their IT systems and blending them into ours so that we can take advantage of economies of scale between the system that we've already built that we know is good and the companies that we want to target, which are high potential bad software. Now our strategy and our technology confluences are more particularly talked about, right? If we want to talk about how strategy confluences with people in the business and in IT, right? How are we communicating our business strategy in the IT implications of it? How are we creating a scenario where our business people understand our enterprise strategy and objectives well enough to articulate their requirements for IT to build it? And how are we articulating our business strategy well enough for IT to understand it in the same way, anticipate what the business is going to ask for, and know what our solutions are going to be in solving for that challenge? This is where we start to have project requests that are useful, aligned, and understood in a way where technology can support strategic initiatives and where we understand why one project is getting worked on now and another one isn't, because we understand our strategy and our overall objectives. From a people perspective, this a lot of the red flags that come in this come from differences in ownership, decision rights, and expectations. At the end of the day, if we don't have a clear business owner of our processes, we have haphazard bits and pieces of I asked for this, and so as I'm driving this, and I'm not including the right people because we don't have clear ownership and clear expectations on who's responsible for what, I start leaving people out of this request for technology, and I build something, and then IT deploys it because they're doing what I asked them to, and then somebody else comes in literally the next day after the release itself and says my system's broken. And this is a tragic mistake and miscommunications because that person could have been included the whole way. And now we have a fire, we're reactive, and people were talking about, can we unroll that? Is that possible? That's not the way to do this. What we also see a lot in this from a people perspective is when people go and take that technology confluence and keep it to themselves with shadow IT and those types of things. And what ends up happening is we have a scenario where my shadow IT is deploying new functionality and then I break something and from a business side perspective. And then I call IT and says, your system is, and I say, your system is broken. And IT's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, I deployed this functionality last week. And now all of a sudden, this system doesn't work. And IT says, what? You deployed what functionality? And like, well, I released this new thing. It's helping our production scheduling become more efficient and more responsive. And IT says, and you didn't think to connect that to our actual demand planning system that functions to pull materials into production. You didn't connect that, and that's where your breakage is because now your production scheduling is like what is happening here? And the business says, don't worry about it, just fix it. And now we're in this finger pointing, this blame mode. And what could have happened is we could have had people who were more responsible with their systems and more accountable because if our relationship between the business and IT were improved, we'd be deploying technology more in sync. We'd be asking if the trust were there, the business, even if they had their own system. And this is there's a bit of a controversy in the thought process that the business shouldn't have and maintain its own systems. That is a myth. That is the type of thing that lives in a different world that doesn't exist, right? The business will always have their own individual systems. And if you don't think that's true, go ask somebody who's dependent on a singular spreadsheet to run their entire job. That spreadsheet is their system, right? That's a singular example. But if you consider a spreadsheet a system and Excel a system, if like a lot of people treat it as, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with this. And you extrapolate that to things like access databases and things like automated workflows and those types of things that exist on the business side. The business has its own systems. It's going to run its own systems, and that's the way that that's going to go. So this thought process that all systems live in IT and only IT is false. The business will always have bits and pieces in that. So what we need to understand is when the business wants to make changes to their systems, if we have a well trusting and well communicated environment, we're talking about these things along the way. And the business saying, hey, we're going to do this. And IT says, okay, cool. Let me do a couple of things on the back end that will help you get that data from the places that you're looking for it instead of leaving you in a lurch when you deploy this and some other team says, what happened? From a process perspective, I'm a big process person, so I think in processes. Process does tend to get a bad name for creating bureaucratic red tape, and when the purpose isn't to say no, is to establish a structure that we can say yes more quickly. If your governance process, for example, is being seen as something that slows down. I talked to a client the other day. We're talking about a case study, and they had this project that was expected from the executive level. This needs to get done, and they're cranking along. It's getting hammered out. It's the number one priority in the organization, and they're just crushing it. And then once they get phase one launched, somebody says, "Shouldn't our PMO be involved in this?" And so, well, yeah, I guess we probably need a PM and this, that, and the other. And the overwhelming sentiment is as soon as the program management organization, as soon as their center of excellence got involved in the conversation, is progress stopped completely. We went from delivering things weekly to I don't know if we delivered anything at all in the last month, right? Process is not intended to slow things down. Process is intended to be able to get things in the right hands of the right people to get things moving more quickly, right? That's what your governance process should do. How do I get the most important things into the most capable people's hands more quickly so that we have broad coverage? This is where requirements processes come in. How do we document requirements, understand them more clearly so that we can get everybody involved? That process takes time. I promise you, it takes less time to spend a week or two documenting requirements with all of the teams involved than it takes to spend one day with the one team that asked for things and then build a whole bunch of stuff and then find out that we missed three other teams that we got to go back and get requirements for. We probably are going to identify them one at a time now, so that 1 or 2 days that you took, now we got to go all the way back. We got to talk to a team that wasn't involved. We got to spend a day or two with them at least, and then we got to talk about how much rework are we going to do? How many systems are we going to recode? How much extra stuff do I need to build? How much am I going to end up building this quote unquote extra to make the code that I already wrote continue to work when I should have wrote it differently to begin with? And then we identify that third team. And now we've added weeks to this conversation because we go through the build, dev, test cycle, and then we identify a problem and requirements. We got to go talk to another team. So we add a week there, and then we add another build, dev, test cycle because that team wasn't involved. Then we find another team. They have another, and then we've added weeks upon weeks when we could have taken 2 weeks up front instead of 1 or 2 days and done this more effectively. When we think about what prioritizing which processes we fix first, and that's a good question. In that you've got to be able to understand where the confluences are the most broken. Where are we going to see our processes get fixed and add the most value? And that value comes from these work streams that come together. So you prioritize processes based on what is going to add the most value in fixing these things so that we can move from things like I have an idea to actually delivering value with a process in a way that requirements are clear. They don't change because when they shouldn't, right? Again, unknown requirements are different than we should have talked to other people. We start to create a scenario where work can enter IT and be accepted based on value as opposed to based on firefighting. So that's really how we should figure through that piece of it out. And as we start thinking about confluences with technology, we start to think about how technology factors into the facilitation of these processes, but also what technology we're building. So when we start thinking about legacy systems that are slowing down change, okay, this is a real thing, right? Sometimes systems are old, they take longer to rebuild, they take longer to manage, especially in a SaaS-based lifestyle these days where we don't even change this thing. They change for us and they stay up to date all the time. What we need to figure out is where technology enables our strategic goals and what processes they're used to do that and what people are necessary to get in there. That way we don't have technical constraints that are preventing the business from accomplishing its goals. A lot of the time, those technical constraints that slowed us down for so many years are a function of this broken communication conversation where we have this massive amount of integrations complexity because we built all these little bits and pieces because we didn't understand well enough to know how to build a couple of bigger chunks. So I'll speed up a little bit. The technology side of things is important though. When we start thinking about how we solve for this, technology is not something that you can avoid. It's something that you should embrace But if we are creating scenarios where we're not considering the quality of the relationship between IT and the business, the technology we build doesn't translate into business value. It's just this stuff. And that's where technical debt really starts to grow, especially when you have just a bunch of stuff. And that's also where your data becomes more fragmented. You have you you have an overly complex architecture because we didn't start thinking about the systems that can do that. We just went and bought new ones. So that's a key component of it. To move on to another topic, what characteristics make a PMO a strategic facilitator instead of an administrative layer? This is a fantastic question. And the real question that we should be asking is how do we know what we should be working on next and why? Are we doing the right work? And as we think about project management as a bridge between strategy, communication, and execution, and project management as a bridge between these confluences, we start to think about how we look at an organization that can partner and create that partnership. And I think of this actually, an organization is not necessarily the right word. It's more of a function at this point, right? As you mature, the organization can become a part of the conversation, but it's overall that organization serves a function that's project management, and within that function, we should be looking for ways to bridge strategy, communication, and execution. How do we understand in a well aligned fashion what we should be working on next and why? And this is where those confluences with strategy and this other set of work streams comes in. What are our objectives? If I know what my company goals are, they're clearly articulated in a way where I know how they should be facilitated within the scope of people, process, and technology. Now I have a framework for understanding, yeah, I get why that project's at the top of the list and mine's at the bottom. That's totally fine. I'm here for the organization. But if I don't know why that project is more important because I don't have a lens on it, then I'm never going to be anything other than frustrated that IT always ignores me. Why do they always ignore me? They must think I have stupid ideas and they're never going to listen to me. So I'm just going to go build my own stuff, right? That's not the case. It's not that you have a bad idea. It's just that your idea isn't exactly what we want to work on right now. We just need to figure out where it fits next, right? That's where portfolio visibility really starts to become a key component of it. How we prioritize, what our resource capacities are, and what it is our executives expect when we start thinking about how we create benefits and value from these types of projects. Overall, at the business level, from a project management function, we need to be in a position where we can define our problem, we can engage our stakeholders, and we know that we can adopt this change when it comes. Knowing how this is supposed to function on a business side is really key to being able to actually deliver value, right? If I know how my business processes function and how my people facilitate those processes, and then I ask IT for something, I've got a real advantage over just asking for something that sounds like a good idea. Thank you for this question, Sandra. What roles are a business analyst positioned to ensure value is being delivered? This is exactly the type of role that fits in with that, right? As a business analyst, the challenge that BAs are commonly put into is the focus is overemphasized on that word analyst. I need to know the data. I need to know all these things. That's important and that's helpful, but I think there's an underemphasis on that word business. And so the analyst side of things creates a scenario where we put the BAs and we heavily embed them in the development team, for example. We've got clients that do that. And so they're focused on technical requirements. And that's not a business analyst, that's a systems analyst, right? We're underemphasizing that word business. So BAs, in my opinion, are really the key in this conversation for value being delivered, in that we want to be able to understand what the business needs and translate that well. The analysis comes from hearing, understanding, and translating that request of the business into something that IT can deliver on, right? Those are key communication points, in my opinion, that are really the key between a positive relationship between the business and IT. And that business analyst role plays a really key component of that. You'll also hear roles like business relationship manager, service delivery manager, product owner. Those are all roles that play a similar space in communication. They have different purposes. Business analysts, for example, tend to be more oriented towards actually documenting the needs and the requirements between stakeholders in a way that they understand. I had this small request from this one team, but and they don't realize it, but this one small request hits this person, that person, and this other person. So I got to go talk to them too, right? Now we're kind of triangulating in on a core list of requirements and user stories that are driven by stakeholder engagement. Users who are prepared because they've been involved in the requirements process, and folks who are able to adopt this change effectively and own it so that when we understand how the business works, we understand the change that we're making to how the business works and what that impact is, and then we're able to effectively use it. From the IT side of the coin and a project management function, IT is responsible for the discussion with the business on scope, timeline, dependencies, those types of things, right? IT can help identify these things if they understand the business well enough and what the request is, and saying that's going to hit these teams, which means it's going to hit these systems, right? IT, of course, should understand when the business needs something by, and how priority factors into that, right? If we have a misalignment between I need this next month, but it's not important, well, why do you need it next month then, right? One of my favorite things, this is as kind of a side note, one of my favorite things is the business comes and says, I have this problem. It's a major problem. I need it to be fixed immediately. And IT says, well, how long have you been having this? But if this is such a major problem, how long have you been having this problem? We come to find out it's been this way for years. And all of a sudden now, the business has run with this problem, we've done this way for years. And now it's a problem. Now it needs to be fixed immediately. What changed, right? That's where IT can lean in and understand a little bit more on how we can add value from that perspective. And a lot of the times it's the customer just noticed it. And now it's causing our customer pain. All right, that's actually a viable change. The business value isn't fixing the broken process, right? The business value is meeting a customer expectation that is just now come up, right? So that's a big piece of that from an IT perspective, and being able to understand well enough to deliver something the business can adopt and sustain. And that project management function comes from um, a place of understanding. What that understanding does is, and to this question, how do QA and testing teams contribute to this communication and execution success? They're usually some of the biggest benefactors or beneficiaries, rather, of the positive communication, because they understand the business well enough. They understand their testing process well enough. Their testing process can be more confined into testing based on scripting, and we don't have questions on why I did it this way and this happened. And the business goes, oh, that's right. We have another process, right? When we get this thing aligned quite well, the business is able to communicate what they need. IT is able to understand it. It gets documented, it gets built well, and then QA and testing becomes that beneficiary of things that happen along the way. And on the flip side of that, if our relationship is good and positive, QA and testing teams also understand intent, right? Especially if you're running an agile development scenario, your testers should understand what we're looking for here. in a way that they can say, this is technically right, but I noticed this little bit of a strange thing. Is this something that you also are interested in? Testing becomes an input for those types of things. And that's where we start to become a little bit more um, keen on the emphasis on understanding process and value before we create a solution on the whole. Project management, product ownership, business analysis, business relationship management. There's a whole slew of different words that come from this. The relationship between IT and the business and the communication that drives decisions, that drives understanding is really the key. We're not talking about just managing tasks. We are managing alignment. We are managing a conversation that is a developing relationship along the way. So I promise we talk about mature to think about this. I do want to answer this question because it's development of one of the questions. How do strong business analysts help prevent scope creep and misalignment? They help identify scope and requirements early by understanding where they're at, right? That scope creep and misalignment is indicative of an organization that is low on the maturity curve. So we'll break this into kind of 5 stages. It's kind of like the number 5 is not important, right? The curve itself and the development along the spectrum is what's important. But when we are in a scenario where we'll say we're maturity stage 1, we are wildly reactive. We're firefighting. Our urgent requests and tickets are reactions to a project that deployed and broke for somebody else, right? What we end up with is a low trust scenario where the business says this is broken and IT says, okay, submit a ticket and we'll do what we can. And it just gets put in line with the rest of the other problems and everything feels urgent. Nothing is properly prioritized. And in a low volume scenario, this isn't as big a deal, right? If you got a small business where something breaks and IT is able to reactively fix that, and our backlog isn't stacking up with things that broke, being stage 1 maturity isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Being reactive when IT is not the driver of a massive organization, then this isn't a bad place. Everybody starts here, right? Everybody starts in reactive, fix this, fix that. At some point, you evolve into IT as more of a service provider, and that relationship with the business starts to take on that service-oriented nature. This is where those types of PMO conversations start to develop. How do we create a way of defining our services, intaking our requests, finding a way to deliver on a function, right? The business says, I need something. And IT's response is, we can deliver that, and here is how, right? We may not have our total understanding perfect. We may still bring in IT a bit too late because the business has been building things, and now we have a sense of urgency. But we're starting to transition into this relationship where IT is providing a service to the business, and as we think about that, IT is doing good for the organization, and that's where the criticality of the relationship starts to begin to grow. As we move in to the later phases of maturity, and back to one of our original questions, IT and the business start to become partners, right? They're communicating. We're creating a relationship between the two where we understand one another. Requirements are coming up all the time because we talk about them together. We're meeting and we're managing relationships that are active. This leads to earlier involvement of IT, which leads to a more realistic picture of what's actually possible with an IT project. Our PMO is facilitating more discussions on problem solving and joint planning. And the business is starting to focus on outcomes and being able to request outcomes from IT. And IT is being able to understand those outcomes and be able to provide solutions that are aligned towards them. We still end up with those strong, loud voices and those individual heroes who understand things better, who will get more work. Because at this point, we have a small subset of people in the business who understand IT, and a small subset of people in IT who understand the business. And those kind of become this core working point that the PMO starts to say, we're going to get these things done here. And that's a facilitation of discussion and a successful relationship. The next part, we start to think a little bit more about sharing business and IT roadmaps and value realization, right? Business capabilities become a real conversation across the board. We start figuring out what do we need for all of our teams and how does IT deliver that? We have strong executive sponsorship that says this is the big picture, and business and IT understand how they are both involved in accomplishing that. What I like about getting to this point, if you're a big enough and mature enough organization, is that we understand, folks. A lot of times, for example, when business users move into IT, that's a great scenario, right? This is where strategic partnerships really are building because we understand each other well. When IT moves into the business and how it starts facilitating a role, what a great way of exemplifying how it is that understanding has grown. What's the real key in this is you start to create this. You started with this centralized PMO, Center of Excellence, whatever you want to call it, and it is responsible for intaking these questions and intaking these requests. And that starts to lean towards the business because the business is requesting these things, right? So this initial PMO, instead of bridging the gap, starts to lean business side. And so IT needs to respond with a capability mechanism for taking those, understanding them, and running them through the IT development process. And that's a key component of this growing mechanism. We have a client that's doing that right now. How do we create a delivery mechanism that doesn't conflict with our higher level center of excellence? And it doesn't make them feel like we're taking the job. We're not. We're now saying, we hear you, and we need to organize our own selves on the IT side to deliver to your expectations. Eventually, we get to a stage 5 integrated leadership maturity position where the conversation of business versus IT is gone, right? All right, we're talking about a digital business that shares accountability across value streams, whether you report to IT or the business. That doesn't matter. We're able to handle this greater complexity based on greater trust and negotiations between, yeah, we could do this. Well, that's not exactly what was like. Okay, we could do this. Those negotiations start to become more diverse and more complex and more fulfilling, and that is a highly functioning scenario. If the business matures faster than IT, what ends up happening is IT ends up being unable to keep up with demand. The business strategy becomes more ambitious, and then we have this snowball cycle. The business wants more, and IT lags behind. And then the business wants more, and this growing gap between what IT can do and what the business needs creates a ton of frustration. This is where shadow IT really starts to become critical to business function, and that's not really what we want. If IT matures faster than the business, then we end up with red tape, right? IT creates this massive structure, and the business says, like, I just need these little things. And the IT says, well, we got to run a process, and it slows everything down. This creates resistance to IT discipline in the business, and tools end up being implemented before the business can own them, and the business doesn't, and we end up with things that the business doesn't want. What we want is these things to mature together. And these maturity gaps aren't necessarily failures, they're just signals in growth, right? So we need to figure out how to solve for this business speed and flexibility, IT press for security, and this balance that kind of teeter totters a bit along the way. Neither side is wrong. We just need to do this together. So, want to leave you with a practical framework before we close. I know I'm at the end of time here, but at the end of the day, we want to ask 5 questions when we think about where are we in this conversation, and how do we do this? How do we understand our soft skills and leadership for being able to improve our scenario? First, what outcomes are we trying to achieve? And this is outcomes, values. What business problems are we trying to solve? And how well are these understood? So that's question one. Question two, who owns the actual results? Do we have a business process owner? Do we have a sponsor? Who's accountable for the actual outcome of this project was delivered exactly as requested? If it goes well, who gets credit? If it goes badly, who gets blamed for it? If the business owns the outcome of their requests and IT owns the capability to fit the request itself, that's a good scenario. What trade-offs are we making along the way? If we understand the difference between speed, cost, scope, risk, security, scalability, and why we want to make these trade-offs between that and one and the other, especially as it aligns with strategic objectives, this indicates a higher level of maturity. Absolutely critical question. How will we know when it worked? How will we know if it worked at all? It's not because we delivered something, right? That's not the end point. If we're talking about outcomes and business value, how do we measure success? How do we measure adoption? How do we count the value that was realized by this? And the better you're able to do that, the more mature your organization. And lastly, what's our communication rhythm? If it's it happens when it happens. If I run into somebody in the hallway or in a Teams chat in another meeting, then great. Or do we have a cadence? Do we have a structure for making decisions? Are we evaluating risks? Are we pulling in the right stakeholders? If we ask better questions up front, are we asking about bigger problems later? So at the end of the day, these are all real good questions to ask to see where you are. What I'll leave you guys with is soft skills are the point here. That relationship between the business and IT is built in. Technical expertise can earn credibility. Communication creates alignment. Trust accelerates decisions. Facilitation turns complexity into shared understanding. And that shared understanding is a soft skill that needs to be developed. Those soft skills will help tech business value. So I want to say thank you for listening in today. We really appreciate your time. I encourage all of you to reach out to us if you have additional questions. We'd be happy to hear from you. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thanks, everybody.